this computer. There we go. Okay. Let's just go ahead and get started. Tell me about your experience, Dom, since you kind of got it going.
Well, I did see the movie when it came out.
Yeah.
The original. And I liked it. I didn't know about all of the the angst and the dissension, I guess, that was going on at the end of the Beatles term. But then over time, you got to understand that there was angst between, especially George and the band, and John and Paul, and it seemed natural. And anybody who's played with other people for a long time, I guess you know what it's like. Any kind of relationship, what it gets to be like, especially people that creative.
Right.
And but what I really liked about it was that Peter Jackson said that Paul and Ringo didn't want anything to do with the production of it. They wanted to be hands off. And what was really nice is when he showed him what he had, Paul right away said, according to his report, that he was so pleased to see how it showed how well we got along.
Yeah.
And that we had fun in the studio.
Yeah.
And that is what I got from it. I mean, I couldn't believe how much fun they were having. Right. And also the way that they just fed off of one another, and it seems like a play session going nowhere, and then you see the songs developing. Yeah, I got the. I'll stop here because we can go on and on and on, and we will. But I love when they're doing Get Back, and I'm yelling at the screen, for California grass. It's for California grass. They weren't there yet, you know.
No,
and they have all these other little lines. I'm going, for some California grass.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
And then to see Ringo and George on the side, and George is working on his next song for Abbey Road, really.
Right.
I don't know, was it something or one of those songs? And I'm going, oh my God, look, we're at the he's just got this idea going. Yeah. This isn't even a song yet, you know, a complete song. So I just loved watching the way that worked.
Yeah. I think that's what struck me is seeing the embryonic stage of so many songs, and that actually showed up on Abbey Road, several songs. What else was I going to say? Well, I mean, also you say this playfulness, the silliness, but when I had this conversation with my friend who is a Dartmouth professor, he's in Finland right now on a scholarship, but the thing that he's brought up with me several times when we talk, and he was born 15 years after the Beatles broke up, so this is a much younger man. He kept talking to me about John Lennon's heroin addiction, and I wonder how much heroin played into his playfulness in the studio. It's not mentioned, but I looked it up on Wikipedia, and that it's briefly mentioned in Wikipedia that did play a factor. Because if you think about the number of side tracks they took with the different songs they played from the past, you know, and old R&B songs and all that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I just wonder if John's head was just going all over the place. I mean, it does anyway, but on drugs, you know, it probably would be even worse. So I'm thinking that might be a factor. That doesn't take away from the fun they had, but
right.
You know.
No, I didn't even consider that. I forgot all about that and didn't know the time period that was going on. Yeah. So that's an interesting point. Yeah. And just the way, you know, I was looking for that edge, you know, where's the conflict? You know, you could see it maybe, but all I saw was this kind of patience amongst them. Like Paul and John had it seemed like patience, like you could tell that they were trying to get something done.
Yeah, right.
But nobody was going off the handle on it.
Except for George walking out.
Yeah, I mean,
that makes me think that George was on the one that was really on the verge of saying, I've had enough, and actually did leave. And actually, I was reading up on it again last night, and he was starting to work on I, Me, Me, Mine, which actually got recorded the day after the rooftop concert.
Wow.
So it was actually the last thing they recorded. No, I take that back. I actually wrote it down. Hang on a second here. No, I didn't put it down. But it was recorded later. And, but he's, in the song, he's reflecting on the selfishness that he observed from, guessing from the other guys in the band. Here comes Bill. So, I mean, he's making a spiritual statement, but he's also commenting on what he probably perceived going on in the Beatles, all the selfishness.
Yeah.
Anyway, Bill is joining us. Give him a chance to connect. I hear something. I hear a dog. Whose dog is that? Is that Bill's?
That's mine.
Okay. Well, just we give a little history. You know, I was a huge Beatle fan from almost day one. In 1963, I heard "Please Please Me" on the radio, and it was on the radio and off very quickly. But I heard it one of the few times it was even played. And then, of course, the Beatles hit the country big time in '64. And so my walls were plastered with pictures of the Beatles, Post magazine covers and posters, and everything on my wall was Beatles by the time I was 15. And what happened is, and so I bought every album, and I saw the Beatles in '64. I was actually, the tickets sold out so fast in '64 in Seattle that a bunch of my friends and I went down to the Coliseum to see if we could sneak in, and we did sneak in. And so I saw the last two songs. I didn't hear a word, but I saw the last two songs. And it was so loud and screaming. And then in '66, I went to San Francisco to see the Beatles at Candlestick Park, not knowing that was their last public performance or paid public performance. But in 1969, I had a born again experience, and I quit listening to secular music for 2 years. So I missed the whole period of Let It Be in Abbey Road until later. So that was sort of like you know, I was just working on Christian music exclusively for 2 years. And then gradually I started listening to secular music again. So I didn't see the Let It Be film until several years later. Anyway, that's my story.
Well, on that, since you know so much about the early years, and I know that they started out in clubs, you know, in Germany and I guess in London or Liverpool. But then when they became a recording band, did they not, I mean, I know of the few concerts, but were they not really a live performance band after that?
Oh yeah, they were performing heavily. They were touring Europe, Japan, out in the South Pacific. Yeah, they were all over the world. I mean, they're huge in Japan. They were there several times. So yeah,
were there concerts like the Shea Stadium kind of concert where out of control, can't hear them, you know, quality bad, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
You know, unlike say Allman Brothers or Stones, where they're just great live bands. You know, I mean, you really go to see them live more than even listen to them on the
But in those days, the sound systems was so horrible. I mean, when I saw them at Candlestick Park, they were opened by a band called The Circle. They did the Red Rubber Ball. I don't know if you knew that song. They did Ronnie and the Ronettes opened for them, and somebody else. But the sound system was not adequate for that stadium. I mean, I can say I saw the Beatles. I really didn't hear them that well.
Right.
And the sound systems started improving shortly after that. I mean, with the Jefferson Airplane later on, and some of those bands, they started. Grateful Dead is actually, we have them to thank for beefing up sound systems. But so all you could really say is you were there for the experience, because the screaming was so out of control.
Yeah.
But yeah, they were definitely performing up until August 29th, 1966. Bill, did you see this? Did you see the film, the series?
Yes, I did.
What'd you think?
Well, Well, I mean, it was amazing to see. You know, I think just technically, what Peter Jackson did was fantastic, and so just as a sort of archival document, it's obviously it's an important um, addition to you know, our sense of pop culture in the late 20th century. I you know, it humanized them, I thought, you know, and it also shows the metamorphosis of you know, what had been basically a group of children when they started out. I mean, they were in their, you know, early or mid-teens, and then, you know, a band that stays together grows up together and often grows apart because you're not as malleable anymore. And so as you hit your late 20s, it just, you become adults, you know,
Yeah.
and so that creates sort of natural kind of like fractures that were evident in the, you know, in the footage.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it was really interesting. Yeah, I don't want to get ahead of myself here.
David.
Yeah, I will confess that I know some Beatles music. I like a lot of Beatles music, but I was not a, you know, rabid fan through the years in terms of knowing everything about them. I can remember as a oh, probably fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth grader or whatever in grade school, going to a classmate's birthday party, and they were playing, you know, Beatle 45s, and that's my kind of first remembrance of some of that. But I think one of the most telling, and I like what Bill said about their growth, because you saw them as that 13, 14-year-old, and then you know, at least pictures, and then later on. But I think one of the most telling parts of the movie for me was when they were discussing somehow or other, you know, how do we get this process going? It was on, I don't know, like the third or fourth day of the thing. And they're talking about Mr. Epstein and how Mr. Epstein did it. And, you know, he was there and he told us what to do. And they don't have that anymore because they're all trying to be in charge. And it was interesting, the respect, because they always called him Mr. Epstein. I guess part of that was, you know, from when they were young, but it just was very telling about their focus person was gone.
Right.
And now they were each trying, well, three of them each were trying to do their own thing in that sense, I think. And two of them obviously were much bigger pushers and more productive too, of their own stuff. It also struck me when they talked about India and the Maharishi experience, and they were saying, you know, we didn't, some of them were saying, you know, we really weren't ourselves. We were like schoolboys, you know, hiding stuff.
Right.
And George said, well, we were supposed to be ourselves. And some of them did and some of them didn't. And that was interesting, you know. So, but anyway, that whole thing of kind of the person that was their pusher and guider for how we get things done was not there. And so they had this collaborative effort that was not easy.
Right.
And also, David, weren't they also were gone through the recording studio with George Martin, and weren't they trying to break away from that sort of control of recording? They wanted to do something that was more open, you know, live, I guess.
Yeah, they didn't want to do the layered overdubs and all
Right.
that. They wanted more of a pure performance, I guess. But yeah.
According to the Wikipedia article, George Martin was definitely part of the planning of this, and he said he wanted them to record like they did in the early days. So you see George Martin in there, but he's not exerting the influence that I expect him to.
Yeah.
But he's
I
a presence.
think they made note of that too, didn't they, during the the production. I thought there was a note made of that. That he was more hands off.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that was going on was that the early recording and most of the recording they did with Martin was he was an employee of EMI, and so everything was done on EMI's dime. There was a budget, it was a definite budget to get the thing recorded, and so the pressure to produce was a different dynamic than it was when in the period that is depicted in the film, because at that point it was all Apple, and it was all on the Beatles' dime. So there was one point where they're saying, we're spending, I don't know what it was, a shilling a foot here for this tape,
Yeah.
and you're spending a shilling. And they were completely unaware of the burn rate, of the cost of having George Martin, they were paying at that point.
Right.
Martin wasn't there except as their employee, and he was probably working on a contract, and the same with the producer, and all the hangers on and lackeys and all that stuff. So it was sort of a bacchanalia, that they were, an ongoing rolling party that was probably spending thousands of pounds a day indefinitely.
Yeah.
And all of those employees were basically their employees. So no one was in a particular rush to get anything done. And, the shooting was probably really expensive too. I mean,
Yeah.
relative to the time. So it was they weren't managers. They weren't, they weren't aware of what was going on financially, probably, or didn't care, because money was considered, differently back then than in that late 60s than it would be. It wasn't as buttoned down for sure.
Well, who funded the filming of that process? Do you know?
They did.
They funded the filming too. Okay.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't know exactly what the
Yeah.
details were, but yeah, definitely. I'm sure that there was a contract,
Mhm.
and that would be interesting to know.
Right.
But without getting overly forensic about this, but
Who had the footage? Who had claim to the footage when Peter
I
Jackson?
think that Apple owned the footage.
Apple?
Yeah, Apple was the producer, and Apple was wholly owned by George, John, Ringo, and Paul.
Right.
And so it was their party, and Apple was notoriously generous among record labels, as far as their Christmas parties and stuff like that. That was a place you wanted to be, and like there'd be all the drugs and booze and 17-year-old scotch that you won't care to have, and so there it was just it was one big party, and they were burning money at an unsustainable rate at that point.
Yeah.
That was putting, and then Alan Klein, forget it, he was a nasty, really nasty person. So John brought him in.
Oh, that was the guy from New York, or
Yeah.
wherever you're from?
Terrible human being.
So what was
Absolutely
his
terrible.
role in all of this and afterwards? Do you recall?
He wanted to be the next Brian Epstein,
Right.
Right.
and he was, in fact.
Mhm.
John thought he could walk on water.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
But that happened after this. No.
well, it was just starting to kind of gel
Yeah.
during this period, and then and so Alan Klein did indeed become their publisher, and they basically he gave away the store to his great profit, and they got screwed. It's a typical music industry story.
Yeah.
Yeah, the-
It was pretty amazing the amount of drinking and eating going on during this. They had people coming in and out with food and liquor or wine or whatever. But
Sure.
what really gets me, and it gets me every time I watch old, especially English footage, is the amount of smoking.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I just couldn't. I just like, oh man, put it down for a while. I was starting to get a sore throat and
Yeah.
cough.
Yeah, I
Just
agree.
watching.
Yeah. Smoking was de rigueur back then.
Oh
Yeah.
man.
Yeah. One of the, you mentioned Klein, and I looked up some stuff about him last night and his history with them. And one of the things it said was that he told them they were about 6 months from bankruptcy, if at the rate that you mentioned, the rate they were going through money. And you know, so that was an interesting thing. You know, you don't think about, well, they've got all this, but like you said, as they were doing this, and they're not concerned about time or footage. They're just there, and they're more concerned about, am I going to find the next word for the song, or, you know, the chord or whatever, and doing other stuff as you've already mentioned. So their you know, their place at that point in time was interesting to me. I wanted to go back to one thing about the you know, George talking to them about, you know, we went, you know, we're supposed to be ourselves, you know, and learn to be ourselves when we went to India, to the Maharishi, and that whole thing. And it seemed like from that point on, every once in a while they would bring up India, and none of the other three were very happy about having been in India, which is
Right.
kind of interesting. But they never kind of let up on needling him about that. It seemed to me there was always, you know, there was always another dig in a sense. So he definitely was not the one that was having the influence on the others there. That was interesting to me.
And he's the only one that kind of pursued that path afterwards.
Yeah. Which is, you know, which is fine. It's not my outlook on life, but it just was apparent that they did not, and it kind of followed along, I think, with some of their other responses to George. You know, they just would not kind of let go of it, you know. I don't know. That was just my observation. He'd come up with some things, and Paul would be looking for a perfection thing, and he'd say, but it's a chord. You know? And he just kind of wanted to get on and play, but he did at one point say, I feel like I'm playing better. I've never played this much day after day after day, and I feel like my fingers are getting loose. And he was appreciating the playing, but maybe not so much the disregard of him having any input, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think I got a sense of how much Paul probably was a control type figure in that group. But on the positive side, I think he wanted just a bit more order in getting things done.
Yeah.
And so that was understandable. You could see Paul was on track, and the other guys were kind of going in and out. But another thing that came to mind was that I always thought of John Lennon as a really solid rhythm player, you know, and to see how good he was as a guitarist, you know, that get back, you know, riff and all that is just, it really impressed me because I had never seen that live. You know, you hear it on the album, but to be honest with you, I thought it was George. I didn't know that was John Lennon doing that get back riff.
Yeah, I did too.
And so it's really cool to see him play.
I mean, a couple of musical points that their sense of rhythm, you know, was fantastic, and that was forged in Hamburg. And also, you know, things there were no click tracks or anything like that back then.
No.
It was like, you know, like Ringo said, I'm the fucking click track. You know, and he was. I mean, their timekeeping was just impeccable, and as loose as everything appeared, you know, it had that kind of like underlying solidity that that was, you know, authentic and truly music. The other thing that was fun to watch was them tuning their own guitars. You know, there was no pitch, you know, devices and all that stuff. Everybody tuned their own instruments.
Yeah.
And those of us who don't have that kind of ear are so envious of that.
Well, because it doesn't get worked, you know, it doesn't get rehearsed anymore. You know, I mean, back in those days, you had, you know, I mean, I'm a keyboard player, so it was like, it was always give me an A, give me an E, and I'd be providing a tone that they could tune to.
Yeah.
Hey, on that note, Bill, let's move on to Billy Preston.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, amazing.
Well, first
Yeah.
of all, I'm still trying to figure out how he got there, because in the film you get the feeling that he's there to appear in the Lulu show, and then I read about it and it says that George brought him in. So I don't know
Right.
what the true story is, how he happened to show up at the right time. But
I
yeah,
read it on a couple of places where it was George that invited him.
yeah. So maybe it was just coincidental that while he was there, he was also on the Lulu show. But yeah, the magic for me hit the spot when Billy Preston showed up.
Man,
That's when it clicked.
It was a whole nother layer,
right.
a whole other level of musicality. Wow, that was.
And the level of civility also went up as soon as he entered the room, and just the whole dynamic changed for me.
Well, and I can say that just I think the fact that Billy Preston came out of the church, the Baptist church, that's where he learned. He was a prodigy. He never had a lesson in his life, and was he played with Nat King Cole. When he was 9 years old, they had him on TV.
Oh, that's
show.
right. I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, and he came up in that L.A. Baptist church scene that produced like Etta James and other fantastic musicians. More than Sam Cooke. Anyway, long story short, having that energy in your band is just it just lifts you off the floor.
Yep.
Because it's real. That's where it came from, and that Little Richard had a huge influence on him, and that's how they met him. He was playing B3 and with Little Richard in back in the early '60s, and they shared a bill with him. They were supporting, and so anyway, yeah, Billy Preston, fantastic. You've probably seen the concert for George. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you haven't seen that, then you really want to watch that, because it's, him doing "My Sweet Lord." Billy sang that song. The musicianship in that show is off the hook, and also the love.
Yeah. Well, let me look at my records here. Billy Preston also worked on "I Want You, She's So Heavy," which is on the Abbey Road album. So he was still around for a while longer, because as soon as they finished this session, they started Abbey Road almost within a month. So they had the energy that kept going.
Oh yeah.
After the filming was done. So he was still in town to play on that.
Yeah. And one more thing I'll say about Billy Preston that was notable to me, because I'm in the business of making videos and films and whatever, is the fact that during the shooting, Billy Preston was just so noticeably absent. Like they shot around him. The angles were basically calculated so that he wouldn't show up. At least in the ground level footage, there was one shot toward the end, which was wonderful, which was straight down at his hands, on the keyboard.
Right.
And that may have been done for contractual reasons, or they probably didn't have a formal relationship at that point, in terms of footage and whatever. So they may have been avoiding him merely because they didn't want to create problems later.
Well, I have often wondered if there was a racism factor going on as well.
Yeah, they could have been.
Yeah.
It's never like that straightforward. It's usually a bunch of different factors, some spoken and some more overt and underrepresented in discussion. But
well, that's what I appreciate about this film, is that it showed his presence very obviously, that he was very much a part of the whole process once he showed up.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Because he was probably the giant in the room musically.
Yeah.
I need to interject. My wife in the other room just mentioned Elvis was mentioned on the movie.
Yes. Yeah, we were going to get to that, Mary. Yeah, Elvis was mentioned for sure. And they sang some of his songs.
There was a
Yeah.
placard toward the beginning about Elvis is dead, the Beatles live, or something like that. And then later on, Paul was doing a little Elvis bit,
Yeah.
so I was going to go back to something about Billy though. I was and ask Bill, when you're trained to play rock piano, do you have to learn how to hold a cigarette in your finger while you play?
I used to. I'd smoke a whole set. I'd play a whole set with a heater hanging out of my mouth.
Yeah. And connected to that, I had never seen guys stick a cigarette on the end of a guitar string to hold it while they're playing.
I did that back in 1965. As soon as I saw, I think Dylan or George do that, I thought I started doing the same thing. I don't know what the purpose
is. A cigarette smoker or been around that. My dad smoked when I was young, but I never. But Paul was a cigar guy. He always had almost always had cigars.
There was a whole trend of cigars in that movie that surprised me.
Yeah.
But what speaking of the vice of smoking, because I was a heavy smoker until 1969, and I mean I was having a conversation with Frank Rizzo about John Lennon a couple of months ago, and the thing that I noticed that I'm a Christian, and I'm dealing with the passions, my vices that I grew up with. And I noticed that most of my vices paralleled the Beatles. I'm not saying they caused them, but smoking, I was smoking. Drinking, I was drinking. Taking drugs, I was taking drugs. Using women for sex, I was there. Then when they started doing heroin, I considered putting a needle in my arm, and that's when I became a Christian. That to me was too far, but I'm just saying, in all my adult life, when I struggle with passions, it goes back to that influence in my life. And so a year ago during the COVID crisis, I started purging my collection of my music of stuff I never wanted to hear again. And most of the songs I don't want to hear again are by John Lennon, because he's angry, he's a womanizer, his songs are about lust, they're about things I no longer want to fill my life with. So so we were talking about smoking. Smoking is one of those last things that, actually smoking was the hardest thing for me to give up out of all those passions. It had a heavy control on me I still smoked a pipe for a while, and I smoked a cigar once in a while, and now I haven't had anything in 10, 15 years. Anyway.
Yeah. Well,
it's interesting. I have a handful of friends who are AA, and they said that was their hardest thing to quit, was the smoking part, not the drinking as much as when it came to dropping the smoking.
Yeah.
Yeah. I smoked 3 packs a day until I was 25, maybe, and 24 maybe. The way I just bought myself an ounce of grass, and every time I wanted a cigarette, I'd roll a joint and smoke that. After 3 days, it's out of your bloodstream, and then it's mostly psychological, but it's the hardest thing I ever gave up. I've done just about everything.
Yeah.
Never did heroin though.
No. Well, one of my musician buddies, a guy who played B3, spent 2 years in prison for heroin. And when he came out, for some reason, he was able to stay clean. And I saw him again for the first time 2 years ago. He's still playing beautiful blues, but he was able to give that up, which is not easy to do.
Paul was actually the heaviest womanizer in the band.
He talks about it too. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, he didn't write. He didn't work that into his writing. His songs are all about, I love you and all this stuff. But like Lennon called him a sexual gladiator, and he was really John was actually, ironically, more interested in relationships, including the relationship. Yeah, I think because his childhood was so hampered and and kind of like circumscribed by the mother he never had, and the insecurities that he was more. John was more of a classic tortured artist, I think. And Paul was there for the party.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of respect for John Lennon, you know, because of the things he went through. And, but, you know, him and McCartney were like polar opposites in a lot of ways. And it's that polarity that creates a good band, you know,
Right.
like the Stones have got Jagger and Richards. If, you know, I was in a great band with people, actually, one of them actually played with John Lennon. But everybody in that band I was in was, except for two of us, and it was a 6-piece band, were cancers. Nothing wrong with cancers. My mother was one, but you know, it was like there was no energy flowing. Everybody was on the same page, you know, energetically and whatever. So there was none of that polarity that, you know, the yin and yang thing that, you know, that you need. You need to squeeze out the sparks, and you'll find that I think a lot of truly great bands have that.
Yeah.
They had it. Certainly.
Yeah, they did, most definitely.
Well, talk about Richards and heroin. I think that's the one thing he said he missed the most.
Yeah, he had
his biography.
he could get the best stuff, you know. He had that, you know, one hit of that Merc cocaine, you're good for the day.
But we should never judge anyone's life by Keith Richards because he's an anomaly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. We were talking about George Martin, and I still can't, I'm still puzzled by the fact that when they did this session, they wanted to record like they did in the old days, yet at some point, George and John turned the tapes over to Phil Spector, and Phil Spector doctored up at least 4 songs. And in the Wikipedia article I read yesterday, George Martin was pissed off, and that's my words, not his. He said the album should have said produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector. That's exactly what he did. I mean, I actually enjoyed what he did to Long Winding Road, but Paul hated it. And after listening to Let It Be Naked, I could hear how Paul really wanted to have it just as a simple piano piece. And that's the way he had envisioned that song.
That kind of surprised me during the movie, that, you know, I guess it was toward the end where they were talking about Long and Winding Road, and they were talking about adding strings, and I'm thinking, I thought you were recording this live. How are you gonna, you know, how's it gonna be a live album, one take album, when you're gonna be adding strings somehow or other? You know, that puzzled me. I wasn't aware of that history, so.
Yeah. Well, as a result, this album came out after Abbey Road because it took Phil Spector so long to add his layers, his wall of sound.
Mm-hmm.
Which gets us back to that whole you know, what we thought of the Beatles when they ended and what we thought of the movie Get Back. It makes it seem as though that's their farewell, but actually it was recorded before their last album. And so, if anything, I'd love to be a fly on the wall of the Abbey Road recording.
Yeah.
Because I think that was probably a more you know, fed up kind of session for some of them than maybe the Get Back.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing that struck me is how patient Ringo was. And we talked about him being the timekeeper of the band, but he was.
I think he was just high. I think he was just very high.
No, but I would disagree with you because
I'm kidding.
Yeah, I know. But he was listening to the conversations and the evolution of the songs. And when it was time for him to add the beat, he was there. He was right with the whole thing. And even when Paul McCartney would tell him exactly what to do, he was willing to cooperate. So, I mean, he's a genius. I mean, and a patient man.
Yeah.
He's a good union worker.
Yeah.
Wasn't it Linda that was talking to, I forget which other of the females in the room that she was talking to at one point, said something about Ringo. He's He's the one I feel the most relaxed around.
Huh,
You
I
know?
missed that, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a,
There was
there's a,
so typical what I think of Ringo moment when he did that fart and the way he made comedy out of that. I just thought that was it was almost like scripted. It was so good.
yeah,
So Ringo in my mind.
yeah, yeah. Huh. Well, it's interesting.
But you're
there's no-
right. You're right. He's up there on his little platform there, boxed in, and he was there every moment.
Yeah. I was just saying, it's interesting. There's 4 of us here. We look a little bit like the cover of Let It Be right now. I want to get a picture of this conversation. So let's all look into the cameras. Ready? 1, 2,
Yeah.
one more time. Okay. That's our Let It Be cover.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how did you guys feel when it was ending? Did you want more, or did you feel like that was
Well,
they had just about covered it all?
well, what surprised me with the rooftop concert is the number of takes they took on this, on like Get Back and one other song they did more than once. We don't get that impression from the other film. So that surprised me. It also surprised me that I learned, and some of the songs that I expected to hear were not in this session at all. They were recorded afterwards. So, I think I wanted more too. I was
I
expecting.
wish they'd recorded Old Brown. I mean, we heard Old Brown Shoe once or twice. What a great song that is. I mean, that was, for the time, that kind of foreshadowed a lot of great music of the 70s. It was so progressive and, musically, and just the imaginative, and I think that was a George Harrison tone.
I think you're right.
And the tunes the tunes he was beginning to bring in, I think, was he was just coming into his own he was in his own as a writer, I think, at that point, and had a lot to bring to the table, which I'm sure pushed John and Paul back a little bit, and had to give him, a full representative share of.
Yeah.
When he left, at the point where he just walked out, it just blew a hole in the band.
Yeah.
They had demand, and they were dead in the water.
Yeah.
And so George was a force an authentic, and he was younger than them, so
Yeah.
it was fun to watch that.
Well, speaking of George, when Ringo is starting to work on Octopus's Garden, and George is giving him advice as where the chord progression should go.
Yeah.
And we all know how it ended up. And so George's advice was taken, but it was fun to see those two working together, because Ringo is not known as a songwriter per se, but that's a great song too.
And Ringo playing the piano.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the part that got.
I mean, there's a lot more to Ringo than met the eye.
Yeah.
And still is. I mean, he's enormously respected, by other by the great drummers, Jim Keltner and other people like that, that are fantastic drummers, owe a lot to Ringo and are free, with their praise of him. And it's not just because he was a Beatle.
Right.
His time was unbelievable, and also his taste and style were so much a part of who he
Got
was.
an interesting vocal tone too. I mean, totally different than the others.
Exactly.
Color
grabs you.
Yeah.
Well, Dom was asking about the Beatles' earlier days, because they had a different drummer when they started out, and basically John canned the original drummer and brought in Ringo because he saw a better timekeeper. And I think that's when the magic started, was when Ringo joined the band.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
They were made in Hamburg.
Yeah.
Playing those 8-10 hour gigs. you know,
Mm.
just popping amphetamines like they were going out of style. So, I mean, they were a force when they went back to England. They were just like an
Yeah.
order of magnitude more powerful than the competition.
Right.
And, never,
I thought it was hilarious when they were talking about a show when Ringo was sick and they had a substitute drummer,
Yeah.
and one of them said, and they went 1-2 and the guy didn't play. They were hanging.
Yeah. So when I was talking about this with my friend, I remembered he asked me what was it like when the Beatles came out, and I remember in junior high, and I went to a junior high that was 50% black, a quarter Asian, a quarter white, and the black kids thought we were crazy to even be interested in the Beatles. They said, "Why don't you listen to James Brown?" But the white kids used to argue about who was best, Beatles, Animals, or Stones, because they all came out about the same time. And we used to have heavy duty arguments about those three bands. And then for me, the Zombies came along, and I thought the Zombies would be the next Beatles because musically and lyrically, they were so much better than the Animals or the Stones at the time, in my opinion. But they kind of died in the water. I mean, some other stuff grew out of the Zombies, but the Beatles just had some kind of staying power that, you know, that we're here we are 50 years, 60 years later talking about them still. Of course, the Stones are still around, but I don't pay attention to the Stones like I did in the mid 60s.
well, there's other things, you know, that were going on with the Beatles that, you know, that they leveraged. They caught the peak of the baby boomer wave,
Right.
and that tracked them through that whole period. And you know, then there was a happenstance of hairstyle, and that was, you know, that was a change that because they were visually represented, Ed Sullivan and whatever, they got massive exposure, and just like they became the face of the 60s.
Yeah.
And they were innocent and lovable, and they were unbelievably witty and funny. Their press conferences were fantastic, and they were televised.
Yeah.
And so they caught television in a way that Elvis couldn't, for example. And because when Elvis was, you know, at their stage in 56 or 7, or even 55, TV was a much cruder affair. And
Right.
there were only about 2 channels. The country was so different in
Yeah.
55 than it was in 63,
Yeah.
especially, you know, well, they really burst on the scene here right in early 63, the Beatles.
Yeah.
And
Well, before you came on, I mentioned, Bill, that in summer of 63, I was riding the back seat of a car with my friend's parents in a suburb outside of Seattle. And I heard the song come on the radio, and my friend and I said, "What was that?" And it was "Please Please Me." And it was briefly on the radio, and then it was off. And then about 6 months later is when the Beatles hit full force. But, you know, at that moment, I knew there was
was that
something.
64?
That was 63. And then Beatles hit, you know, came to our country in 64. But
That's right. Okay.
yeah. But Please Please Me had a brief a moment on the radio airwaves in the summer of 63. They were already big in Europe, but they hadn't reached us yet.
Yeah, that's right. I remember, you know, the January of 63, which would be what, almost 60 years ago. Now, I had a paper route, and I just started a paper route, and the guy I was taking it over from, he mentioned, you know, "Are you going to watch the Beatles on?" And everybody was talking about the Ed Sullivan Show.
That was 64.
That was, yeah. So think what had just happened,
Yeah.
you know, in America
Right.
at that point. You know, Kennedy, you know, had his brains blown out, and you know, with that, a lot of idealism was shattered, and people were just like in you know, absolute disarray.
Yeah.
And they came on and, you know, filled a void, I think, you know, in the hearts of a lot of young people who are just looking to go crazy
Yeah.
over something
Yeah.
and needed it. And they caught that wave, you know,
Yeah.
and they were brilliant
Yeah. They were.
and brilliant enough to do it. The other thing that I think, and I'm talking too much here, but the madcapness of that all came from, you know, we were working with George Martin. He was the producer of The Goonies, you know, which was this crazy TV show that kids in England love. And they all loved it too, you know, so they play that madcap, you know, energy and all that stuff. And you can even see that in Let It Be.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
playing super slow. I think I'm gonna be sad. You know, just doing the slow versions of things and
Or when they do
Oh, when they did with the accent, didn't they do one of the songs with like an accent, German accent or something? They were.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then they do
Pretty funny.
The Two of Us with their gritted teeth. To us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
You know, and
Play with the can.
I was talking to Sandy about them, and Sandy grew up in a home, a very conservative home without much TV. And I was telling her how the Beatles were like the Marx Brothers, and she said, "Who are the Marx Brothers?" So, but there was sort of that Marx Brothers quality to the four of them as well.
Yeah, definitely slapstick.
Yeah.
And
look at the two movies they did. You know, it's just
Yeah. And then
which is another thing, right? Talk about marketability and the way they were marketed. I mean, their films were good. They did well. They're good actors in a way, and they were just so presentable. I mean, when you compare them with the Stones,
yeah,
how they were marketed and how they were presented to everybody.
Right. Yeah.
The Beatles had a bigger audience that were attracted to them, probably.
Yeah. Where'd Bill go? That's it's like
So
George
quiet.
leaving the band. George left the band. Oh, he's back now.
I got the wood stove, you know, I had to clean out the ash box this morning, so I'm rebuilding a fire.
Okay.
And, trying to keep it from dying. Well, this is great. I just think that, you know, as a songwriter, to watch them work and watch these things evolve, and their lack of concern about you know, the particulars of lyrics and things like that, and you know, kind of the daffiness of even their finished songs. A lot of them, you know, on standing on their own, the lyrics don't make a lot of particular sense, but then songs can, you know, support that kind of like I don't know, disarray. And they, you know, it was more about the melody, the energy, and it was interesting to watch that. That was something that, you know, that struck me that I'd never even thought about. The craft, I guess, the craft was in the madness, you know,
Right.
and it was more about the energy, I think.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, as a musician, can you guys name some of your favorite Beatles songs to perform?
To perform? Ooh.
Yeah. I mean, I'm assuming you've all done at least a couple of Beatles songs. I'm just curious, not what to listen to, but what you played.
Oh, that's interesting, because until recently, I didn't play Beatles songs. And then I was getting together with Mike Keating and another guy, a friend, mutual friend, Pat. And this mutual friend brought his complete Beatles songbook together, and we started playing.
Mm-hmm.
And geez, I don't remember which ones we played, but any one we played, it was fun to play.
You mean this one?
No, these are, I think it might come, no, that's complete scores.
Yeah.
This the watered down, just chords and lyrics.
Yeah, I used to have that one too.
The songbook, I actually had it bound so that you can open it and hold it open, as opposed to that.
Yeah, good idea.
I have to think about that one. Volkert.
Well, for me, when I started performing Beatles songs, my parents sent me to boarding school in 10th grade. So I was 15 years old. And my roommate was the son of a well-known folk singer. And he and I would spend every afternoon learning songs. And we gravitated towards the Lennon-McCartney duo sound. And the song we loved to do, probably more than any other during that year, was I'll Be Back. You know, if you break my heart, I'll go, but I'll be back again someday, or whatever it goes. And so that's the first song that came to my mind. Just the harmonies, the chord structure, the changing from minor to major. That song still does magic for me. And I hadn't done that song in years. And when I was playing the Keene Farmers Market one time, and I had my baritone guitar, so I could tune it down or play it in the lower key now because I can't hit the high notes anymore. I started playing it one time, and this guy was in the market, came running up to me, and he sang the harmony part with me. It was like a magic moment that I'll never forget. It's like I was back to being 15 years old and singing a song with my buddy. So that was a magic moment for me.
Well, I will tell you that it just came to mind. The first song I learned, I taught myself, I wanted to learn it for some reason, I don't know why, it was Rocky Raccoon.
Yeah.
And that's that one I kind of revert back to every now and then just to get my hands on the guitar and play something. That's the one, because it kind of repetitive, and
But it's a fun song. Yeah, that's a blast.
it kind of the way the chord structure is, it reminds me a little bit of Wildflowers, by Petty. It's the same thing over and over, but but you can get to it.
And I think that song was created under the influence of Bob Dylan. I mean, because of that relationship they developed with Dylan, because there's a little bit of a mockery in Paul's tone of voice that sounds a little bit like Dylan, the way he kind of talks it. So yeah, but that's a fun song.
Yeah, it's fun.
What about you, Bill?
Well, a song I played and think a lot of, Across the Universe. That's a great song. Lately, I had to learn can't remember why, but I had to do it. I learned Here Comes the Sun, which is some interesting changes of meter in it. Yeah. There's some bars of 5 in it. And the structure is really interesting, and it works. Yeah. What else? Can't Buy Me Love. Yeah. Is a great rock song, I think. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I probably played most of the Beatles tunes at one point or another in my life. Yeah. And my brother-in-law's, he lives in LA, but when he comes out, we used to sit at the piano and just get trashed and basically go through all the pages and sing these songs. It was just such fun. And, we really bonded over that because we didn't have much else in common. Yeah. Yeah.
David, have you done any Beatles songs?
Well, I certainly haven't performed, like you guys have, but I think Let It Be is one that just kind of, I've enjoyed from time to time. And of course, a couple of years ago, I had to learn When I'm 64.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was here, that was here in New Hampshire, right?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
So had to learn it.
So Bill, what you were saying, that made me think, I taught guitar lessons for 50 years. And for 45 of those years, I could use a Beatles song to teach a guitar technique. All of a sudden, I couldn't do it anymore. The kids had no idea who I was talking about. But like it was the folk music of several generations. And then all of a sudden it died. And it's like, who are the Beatles? What's this song? I mean, the kids all of a sudden didn't know what I was talking about.
Well, it's amazing the staying power they've had, because if you think about when I was, say, 15 years old, that would have been 1966. At that point, Glenn Miller had been dead for 20 years. He was killed during the war.
Yeah.
And we regarded him as absolutely like, like something from the Mesozoic. I mean, it was like, that dude was a dinosaur that, that only really old people, even had any regard for. But now here we are 60 years later, 60 years ago, in 1965 would have been 1905. And what are we talking then? We're talking like,
yeah,
absolute, antiquities.
yeah,
But we're still talking about, bicycle made for two.
yeah,
In a sense,
right. Yeah,
and so the music back in the early 1900s was probably more sophisticated than the music we're talking about.
yeah, yeah,
In a lot of ways. Because
yeah,
the gramophone really ended the American musical experience in a lot of ways.
yeah,
People didn't make music anymore; they listened to records,
yeah.
and that was tragic in a way. But I
I agree.
digress.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned Glenn Miller, because I grew up in a home, my parents listened exclusively to classical music. I mean, I grew up
Yeah.
on Bach, Tchaikovsky, Brahms,
Yeah,
and my brother was in the Army, in the US Army, and he came home with Glenn Miller in the late 50s. And my world changed with Glenn Miller. All of a sudden, there's another kind of music out there. And then right after that, I discovered rock and roll. So between those two experiences, I tapped into the American experience all of a sudden. And I've been hooked ever since, obviously. But so for me, Glenn Miller was kind of the starting point of expanding my horizons.
sure. Yeah. My dad was playing, jazz. I mean, I go to bed every night, he'd be playing, Jack Teagarden or Louis Armstrong, or, because my dad was a guitar player in the 30s. And
Wow.
that was his, métier, was, all the, not only Dixieland, but swing, Errol Garner, people like that, like I've still got all those old records.
Yeah,
And,
cool.
yeah, Fats Waller.
But the other thing you commented on that I thought was interesting is you feel like gramophone killed homemade music.
Absolutely.
And what I'm experiencing is I'm at my church right now. I'm trying to revive informal singing after the
Yeah.
service in the coffee
Yeah.
hour.
Yeah.
And we don't have a body of songs that people just like to sing for the fun of it anymore. I mean, yeah, I mean, you and I and we can all sing "Blowing in the Wind" because we're imbued in that world. But to have a collection of music that crosses all generations that we can all just sit down and sing, it just doesn't happen like that anymore. And I think that it's gramophone, it's video, it's electronic media, it's iTunes, it's downloadable music where everybody's listening to something different. We have nothing to pull us together.
Yeah. Well,
I think that's pretty true. My home church back in the Midwest, in Northwest Iowa, in the early 1900s had a brass band. Had my mother came from a southern Minnesota congregation. Her mother played cello, and other people in the family played strings. That was not uncommon on the prairie. In the early 1900s, people had a piano in their home and knew how to play.
Every home that had any claim to respectability had an upright in the parlor, and
the generation that has just recently passed, I think, still had some of that from their childhood, where everybody could sing "Let Me Call You Sweetheart," or there was a whole kind of booklet that one of those churches had of things that people knew, and it just that's, things have shifted.
I think go ahead.
I was gonna say I still remember Mitch Miller, who was sort of the end of that era in a way, because he was
horrible.
but yeah, horrible. But at the same time, he was bringing together music that people had been singing for generations. So
Yeah,
that you
I
could still
agree.
sing
Yeah, my
along.
grandparents watched him religiously on
Yeah.
Sunday nights.
Yeah.
And Mitch and Lawrence, well, that was our home. And my
Oh,
dad,
God.
I grew up probably knowing more polkas and waltz music than
Lawrence,
Beatles
well,
music, because my dad listened to a German station from New Ulm, Minnesota every Sunday when he was not out in the fields. That was the station that was on, and it was polkas and waltzes and schottisches, and that's what
Wow. Interesting.
Great.
Yeah, there's I did a paper once on John Philip Sousa, and he was there during that whole transition to Edison invented the gramophone in 1874, I believe. It was really early, but like the the technology of recording really absolutely pulled the rug out from under American music making, because in those days you'd walk down the street in the evening and people would be sitting out on the porch making music,
Yeah.
making their own music,
Right.
and it was a wonderful um, kind of bonding factor in American life that the gramophone and then later radio, especially commercial radio. Anyway, it's the whole history of media that
Yeah.
that
Mary wants me to ask a question.
Okay.
Are you guys familiar with the term skiffle?
yeah.
Yeah, I thought you would. We came across it, I don't know, sometime a couple months ago, watching YouTube things, and it was a British version of Got Talent. And there was a guy singing, and one of the judges that day was Tom Jones. And the guy that was singing was the son of Donovan, was it? No. Anyway, his father was the one who popularized the really fast version of Rock Island Line.
Yeah.
Oh, Lonnie Donegan.
That's it, Donegan. And that's the first time we had really heard the term skiffle music, because that's what they called it back in those days, was skiffle groups or skiffle music.
So you
And
just brought
the Beatles talked about that on the somebody, I forget who mentioned skiffle, but that
yeah,
came
but you
up
just
in
brought
the
it full circle, because that's the Beatles started as a skiffle band. Yeah, exactly. And I still remember in 1967 we had a rock festival in Washington State called the Sky River Rock Festival, which they say is the prototype for Woodstock. And well, let's see, Woodstock was 69, right? So this had been 68. But my favorite band of that show was called the Cleanliness and Godliness Skiffle Band. And they lined up across the stage. There was probably 10 or 15 of these people playing acoustic instruments. And there was just something refreshing about them after hearing all these loud rock bands, because it was quieter and a little more intimate, but also a lot more playful. What we would call jug band music in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was just a lot of fun. Yeah.
Jug band was, a big part of my life, and then the soundtrack. There was used to be a song on a show on by a guy named Dick Summers on WBZ AM, which was a music station at that point. And Dick Summers would have Jim Kweskin and other people on there that were, basically jug band.
Yeah.
Love and Spoonful came out of that
Yep.
kind of, out of that genre. And that harkened back to the music making pre-phonograph, roots of Americana, that kind of thing.
Well, it's the whole idea that if you don't have a drum, you get a pot and pan out of the kitchen and you just play along. You don't need to have all this fancy equipment.
All our great grandparents, used to push the table to the side, on Saturday night, and somebody be thumping out a jig on a piano or whatever, and people be dancing in the kitchen. The neighbors would come over.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that's the heart and soul of the musical experience. It still is.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the Beatles were trying to get back to with Let It Be, because they'd been through the, that kind of massive overdub, you know, projects like like Sergeant Pepper's and
Yeah.
the White Album and things like
White
that.
Album.
And that's almost like, you know, veneer. It's almost like you're just putting down layers and things like that. It's somewhat disembodied from the joy of music making.
Right.
It's more just like applying layers of musical paint.
Well, and
Well,
that's,
you mentioned Dickie Summers. That's a great DJ voice that guy had. He was
Dick Summers was great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he
Yeah.
jumped on the whole love thing too, you know. This is Dick Summers, and
boy, that was a flash.
yeah. I mean, you know, a lot of hanky panky went on to his soundtrack.
I have to get going. I have a meeting in Keene.
I gotta go too.
okay. Well, this was good chatting with you all. Thank you very much. And
Yeah, thanks for good idea, Volkert.
well,
Really
thanks for
good.
joining me. Okay. Have a good day. We'll see you later.
Take care.
Yep.
Bye
Bye.
bye.